I'm a huge proponent of a West Coast pipeline, and it is thinking ahead to what is the market for oil going forward. And so, obviously, going west, you're hitting Asian markets, and that just happens to be, the majority of human population is in Asia. By I think about 4.5 billion. We expect the most growth out of Asia, and we also expect the most, raising from lower income to middle income. Probably about 1 billion Asians will go from low income to middle income, hopefully. If everything goes well, we definitely want them to achieve that middle income status. And that by definition means more energy use and more oil use. Going east is, it seems to be to feed a domestic market. That market is quite small. We would just be displacing oil that we send underneath the Great Lakes to go over top of the Great Lakes. And Europe is probably, a market where oil demand has plateaued. Demographically, they've already probably hit their peak, so they'll start to shrink. So the business case for Asia is just.
I've been looking forward to getting a chance to talk to Heather Exner-Pirot. I consider her right at the top of the list of people who are writing well-informed, but writes beautifully, by the way, but needed information for us if we're going to discuss, things like a pipeline, things like what our oil industry is going forward, the oil and gas industry, both sides. She's the Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, also a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada, a prolific writer, both sides of the border. Heather, thank you for finding time.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Let me try a bit of a warm-up question. If I asked you what the biggest myth is when you see the debates around oil and gas in our country, what comes to mind?
I mean, there's a lot to choose from
Yes.
on such a question. I guess for me, the myth is that, there'll be no more demand for oil, for example, after 2030,
Yeah.
or they would drop off precipitously, that there'll be no market for our oil if we start building some more infrastructure now. And there's, you can very easily question how, whether global oil demand will fall when population is still growing, when there's still a lot of people in underdeveloped countries who are still looking to get into developed or middle class income brackets and will necessarily use more oil. I often point out that we use almost the same amount of wood mass and dung as we did in 1800. It's a smaller proportion of our energy system, but it's about the same amount, absolutely. But then there's also the flip side. Even if global oil demand did go down, a lot of other supply is also going to come offline in the next few years. And Canada has those tremendous long life reserves. So I just think in any scenario, people are going to need Canadian oil. We're going to have a market for Canadian oil. And I don't worry about stranded assets. I worry about energy crises.
I loved a piece you wrote recently because it was, again, contrary to sort of the general discussion, but not maybe as thoughtful as we needed when there is that discussion. You wrote, no, we're not done building pipelines in Canada, where you state that Canada is going to build more pipelines. You said it's inevitable. It's how much money, how much frustration we spend on these endeavors and by whom. But my point is, I was thinking, of course, and I think most people do, are we building another pipeline to the West Coast? Are we going to get it to the East Coast? So let's start with that, and I'll go further into what you were talking about in that article.
Great. Well, I'm a huge proponent of a West Coast pipeline, and it is thinking ahead to what is the market for oil going forward. And so, obviously, going west, you're hitting Asian markets, and that just happens to be, the majority of human population is in Asia. By I think about 4.5 billion. We expect the most growth out of Asia, and we also expect the most, raising from lower income to middle income. Probably about 1 billion Asians will go from low income to middle income, hopefully. If everything goes well, we definitely want them to achieve that middle income status. And that by definition means more energy use and more oil use. Going east is, it seems to be to feed a domestic market. That market is quite small. We would just be displacing oil that we send underneath the Great Lakes to go over top of the Great Lakes. And Europe is probably, a market where oil demand has plateaued. Demographically, they've already probably hit their peak, so they'll start to shrink. So the business case for Asia is just so much better.
When we talk about, though, Canada's appetite for going, let's say, to the west coast of British Columbia, I mean, I'm one of those people who sits there. I'm really from Missouri, as I say, show me state. I know the language around it has changed somewhat, not from Premier David Eby out in British Columbia, where he says no new pipeline, period. Are you optimistic that we could actually, say, revitalize the Northern Gateway pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, again, people say it's optimistic to think. For me, it's realist As my piece describes, it's inevitable, not because I'm so optimistic that it's so easy to build in Canada. It's inevitably because the resource is so good and the benefits are so obvious that at some point we're going to
Yes.
need, we're going to need to access. And that point is now. I mean, we could have used it 5 years ago, obviously, but now it's starting to get dire. So there's a lot of, a year ago, I would have said, no, Northern Gateway's dead. And I have to say, Trump did us a huge favor. I joke we should name this pipeline after him because there would be no talk of a new Western oil pipeline without that threat from Donald Trump shaking us out of our complacency. So Danielle Smith is obviously a huge proponent of it. I think she will move heaven and earth, and Alberta has some resources by which they could fund, subsidize, market product, produce product for a pipeline. They have many tools that they can use, and I trust that she'll use all of them. Mark Carney, coming to Stampede, suggested that it's very, very likely that an oil pipeline will be amongst the projects, the nation building projects list. And even David Eby has softened, I would say, some of his rhetoric. A year ago, zero chance, the BC NDP government would have accepted. And almost every month he kind of changes, softens his tune such that now he says he's against public subsidies, federal subsidies for an oil pipeline, not the pipeline itself.
Yeah, well, he's another story. I mean, what's fascinating, of course, he's kept in the majority power by two Green Party members who don't seem to be bothered by the fact that he canceled the carbon tax. I'm talking one of the pillars of the Green Party was the carbon tax. And then David Eby canceled it, but they're still supporting him. So we'll see. They may be more flexible when it comes to the practicality of keeping that government in power. But let's come back to something I started with, which is the myth. I mean, we had to deal with now Heritage Minister, former Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, saying, the Kinder Morgan pipeline is operating at only 40% capacity, and that justified no new pipelines in his mind. I'm thinking that's a couple of things there. One is that doesn't seem to be accurate, and I'd like you to correct him on that. And the second is that may be what Minister Carney is, or Prime Minister Carney is dealing with within his own caucus.
Yeah, two great points. So on the first one, Stephen Guilbeault, it is no secret or surprise. He used to work for Greenpeace. He used to work for Equiterre. He was very far left, environmental activist, who scaled Ralph Klein, former Premier Ralph Klein's house. And so just imagine the counterfactual where an Alberta far-right politician scales a Quebec Premier's house, scares their wife, and then becomes a minister in a conservative government.
Yeah.
So it was, it was untenable to begin with, and he was very against. But here's where, so he says TMX is only or Trans Mountain is only at 40%. That is wrong. According to Trans Mountain itself, it's at about, it's vary between about 80, 90%. It filled quite fast. People had to appreciate it only came into service a year ago. So a lot of new projection had to come online to fill it. The most generous interpretation of his comments is that Trans Mountain is 80% long-term contracts, 20% spot. And spot isn't exactly 40%, but maybe it's closer, to 40%. So, but we're actually at almost 90% in some of the better months. So totally inaccurate. But why that should bother people so much is that because he was the Minister of Environment and Climate Change until a few months ago, and he was the person who ultimately had the veto to build new interprovincial pipelines in Canada. So the person that has the veto doesn't bother to know the facts. I feel like everyone in downtown Calgary would intuitively know that that fact was wrong. You would be like, you would question it immediately. That can't be. He didn't know it was wrong. He was comfortable repeating it. His staff didn't know it was wrong. This is a government that bought a $34 billion pipeline, and they don't know what the economics are, what its return on investment are. Imagine any other CEO or executive who owned a $34 billion pipeline, not knowing whether it was being profitable, whether it's making return or not.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to that just for a second, but I'm thinking in terms of, the internal caucus that Prime Minister Carney is dealing with. I mean, they still have all the same faces across the table. I mean, and that's a problem in many of the files, the minister files. But in this case in particular, it's a huge one. And I sort of look across, and none of these people spoke up in favor of pipelines. None of them publicly, whether it's Chrystia Freeland or Dominic LeBlanc or, Sean Fraser. I mean, the list is a long one. So I'm just going to be interesting the internal dynamics. I know Prime Minister Carney, for a guy who wasn't a politician, sure sounds like a one to me in terms of he playing both sides all the time. So, but that's got to be a major challenge. Now they
Yeah.
did pass Bill C5, which gives the cabinet the ultimate decision making on one of these projects. But man, I wouldn't mind being a fly on the wall for the CBC drama on that.
Yeah. I agree. And I think, I think many people have been pleasantly surprised. Mark Carney in many ways is acting like a small c conservative or progressive conservative
Mhm.
prime minister on military spending, on things like Israel and Iran, and on nation building projects, on moving, getting rid of red tape, cutting the public sector, reforming regulatory. These are all positive things. So positive, again, that the Conservatives voted with the Liberals on C5 to pass that flawed bill, but also, better than nothing bill. And so now the opposition seems to not be coming from the right in Canada, but will start to come more from the left. And as you say, the exact same people that brought us to this point over the last 10 years, kind of the economic, collapse that we've been facing are the exact same people in the cabinet today. And so this will be, I think people certainly out west in Calgary in the oil and gas sector are trusting Minister of Energy Tim Hodgson, are giving Prime Minister Carney the benefit of the doubt, given what he's done and said so far. When I say that, even Premier Smith and Premier Moe and oil and gas CEOs, I've heard directly saying they're giving him the benefit of the doubt and they're cautiously optimistic. And so now we know it's going to be the left flank that's going to be the issue. And we'll see how organized they get. But there's nothing left of the left in a sense after the last election. Carney and the Liberals won only because they pivoted to the center right. That's how a lot of those Liberal MPs saved their seats. And I think they probably know that. And so it'll be up to him to manage his caucus. But with Conservative support, there'll be very little that he can't get past.
Well, it's fascinating to see. Come on, he talks about an energy superpower, not giving me the definition of that, by the way. But the first time I heard that was 2006 with Stephen Harper. And he repeated that many times. It's not a big revelation, but I had to smile when I hear that. If I was a conservative, I'd want copyright on many of the things that Prime Minister Carney has done. But that's one that jumps out. I'm still not sure what he means. Does he mean we're going to have the biggest solar panel farms in the world? Because I'm sure he could bend it to that if he chose to, and all sorts of renewables could be part of that. I mean, do you have any idea specifically what that means?
Well, I don't know what he means, but absolutely.
Yes, that's what I meant.
I know what it means, so we do talk, in international relations, you do talk about superpowers. It goes to, there were great powers, for example, in Europe. And when after post-war world, Cold War, you had two superpowers, Russia and the United States. That's the first time we started talking about superpowers. And in the context of energy, when we talk about superpowers, just countries that can manipulate markets, use coercion, use soft power to advance their own interests. It's Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States. Those are who are energy superpowers today. On China, you might say to some extent they're a superpower on some critical minerals. Again, because they have market manipulated power. But so what is a superpower? It's when you are able to use your leverage, whatever you have, in our case, energy and resources, to leverage your really soft and hard power for your own interests. There's no such thing as a renewable superpower in the world. So you can is Iceland a renewable superpower? Because they have great geothermal, we have great hydro. That does not get you anything on the global stage. That does not allow you to exert power vis-a-vis other nations. And so people can say conventional and conventional superpower. I get the politics behind it. What I mean when I'm talking about energy superpower is Canada being able to leverage its world-class resources. We have it for oil, we have it for natural gas, we have it for uranium. Leverage that to support alliances, to support our allies, to prevent coercion by authoritarian countries, use it to advance our values and interests on the world stage. Unfortunately, hydro and solar don't get you there.
Well, it's also, I think, a marketing phrase because most Canadians say, yeah, we'd like to be a superpower, especially in light of sort of the so-called Trump threats over the last 6 months. People want to feel their oats with that. But there's a lot of obstacles there. And it's something that you've also talked about. But I look at are we going to get anywhere if we don't get rid of Bill C-69 or the oil tanker moratorium Bill C-68 or Bill C-12, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, all of those things. I think that's what Synovus was referring to. They said we'd kind of be interested, except for you got to really change your legislative background before we're throwing money at this.
Yeah, exactly. And so what C5 did is, the Building Canada Act that, miraculously they passed in a couple of weeks. So impressive legislative achievement there. But it allows the government, frankly, to choose, nation building projects, winners and losers, that they will give a softer ride, an easier ride on regulatory issues. And that's all fine and good. But of course, if you're in the resource and energy sector, you would like better regulation for all your projects.
Yes.
And I made this point, many people made this point. So C5 maybe is meant to build nation building infrastructure, build more pipelines, build more railroads. What is the point of building a pipeline if you have an emissions cap and you cannot fill it? If you have an oil tanker ban and you cannot ship it? What is the point of building railroads if you cannot build mines, if you cannot attract investment to build mines because of the Impact Assessment Act C-69? So C5 maybe was a good start. It was a good indication to investors, that this is a government that's serious, it wants to attract investment, will make some moves, but it's very much unfinished business. So we're all cautiously optimistic, but it's going to be the fall legislative session where we find out how serious are the Liberals about attracting investment. So far, it's all rhetoric. It's not action on the ground yet.
Well, it's funny. I've done some stuff on, coming from an investment background. It's really straightforward. I make a real distinction between economic analysis, which is super valuable, but business decision making. It's not the same thing. And when I read in our general media, that's confused a lot of times. Just because you're an economist, you can do brilliant work, but it doesn't mean you get the investment markets. And vice versa. You could be a credit market expert, which we need in this country. I mean, we have a credit market problem, a debt problem. So you better understand how the credit markets actually operate. Doesn't mean you understand other things from the economic world, let alone politics, which doesn't understand either of them. So that's why I'm looking at it from that point of view, is saying, in the end, we need to attract capital.
Yes.
And what does capital need in order to at least take another step forward? And as I say, all of these bills are in the way right now.
Absolutely. And the most perfect example of that, I think, is the emissions cap and related to the industrial carbon price. And I'm not even opposed in principle to an industrial carbon price. And Alberta has had one since 2007. It was the first jurisdiction to have a carbon price. And it has leveled the playing field and has incentivized, reducing some emissions. But there is a point where the carbon price is so high that you become uncompetitive. And I think that's the part that this last government did not understand. When you're going to, $95, all of a sudden, for natural gas, for example, where natural gas is so cheap in Western Canada, we could be a data center AI superpower, to use that term. But with the industrial carbon price, in many cases, the cost of natural gas was tripled. That you were adding $4 to a $2, a price per unit. And now you're not competitive. And now all those data centers and AI is going to Texas, maybe Pennsylvania, Virginia, all these places. And so that's a perfect example where, the economists will say this is so efficient and this sophisticated, solution. But in the real world, it led business to go to, capital went to places where it was easier to invest, cheaper to invest, often where emissions were higher. Either China with its coal or even Texas, where they have to use more natural gas and don't have the same methane emissions. The industrial carbon price drove capital to invest in natural gas in Texas, where your emitting is higher.
Yeah, and I look at other things that are happening right now with the U.S. is going to lower corporate taxes, as an example. Yes. We're in a competition for capital, and that's another example of how our politicians don't seem to have a firm grasp of that concept, even despite the fact they'll choose one store to shop in over another because of price. But that level of common sense doesn't seem to inform too many of our decision making, at least over the last 10 years. And you look at the capital investment numbers, they continue to be horrendous.
Absolutely. And, LNG, for example, in Mexico, TC Energy, based in Calgary, but very much a North American company. Enbridge, I would say the same, it really, and have been spending the vast majority of the capital expenditures in the United States or in Mexico. And TC Energy had an LNG export terminal come online. I can't remember the exact number, but it was like a year or something like that. The Mexican government, which is a left-wing government, progressive government, moved heaven and earth. They got the investment. They are, the capital costs that you would normally have to pay in Canada, all that was removed for them. So there's, and I'll say offshore oil in Newfoundland, and this has been coming up in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Where Atlantic Canada really needs development. We were talking about, building a pipeline, probably a $50 billion pipeline to ship oil so Ontario and Quebec don't have to rely on the United States. In the meantime, you're quashing basically Atlantic offshore oil development with your regulations that they could be feeding into the East and developing their economy. But it's, where people will choose Guyana offshore over Newfoundland offshore all day long, because it's faster and it's cheaper. And you're seeing Guyana boom, and you're not seeing Newfoundland and Nova Scotia boom. And now we're reversing some of these things, where literally Nova Scotia has been reversing some of the moratoriums, some of the bans that they're putting on.
Yes, right.
And just canceled, in 2023, put a veto on some offshore exploration, just reverse this. So that last week they were inviting new licenses for offshore exploration.
Let me come back to, and it's part of this whole thing, the emissions cap. One of the things that I've been very critical of with all of the environmental policies that have come through over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, they never did a cost benefit analysis, and that's lacking in so many. I mean, I could just go through, here's this list of 12 things where you spent X amount of dollars and you have no idea how it performed that way. And I'm sort of concerned about the emissions cap from some of the work that you've done. You've done some work on this. That just shows how darn expensive it is, if you're, per ton of emission reduction. And it just doesn't make any financial sense.
Yeah, and I'm happy to dive into that. So as we know, we just pulled the carbon price, the consumer carbon price at $80. That Canadians felt that was too high, and it was getting killed at the pump and on their utility bills, and $80 was too high. So that's a good benchmark. People can appreciate, how they affected them personally. When the emissions cap policy was, so it's not policy yet, but it's proposed, and then they have to do the consultation. Of course, Alberta, the sector were opposed. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers got Conference Board of Canada to an analysis. Alberta got Deloitte or S&P Global. So we had these 3 third-party analyses to determine how much will it cost. And the answer was a ton, tens of billions of dollars, terrible, atrocious. Environment and Climate Change Canada said that methodology is flawed. You guys don't know what you're talking about. And so to your point, Mike, it is a requirement with this legislation that they do a cost benefit analysis. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, independent, arm's length, third party does that. So they did the analysis based on what ECCC had given them, their assumptions, and found it was going to cost $20.5 billion. And using their math of how many megatons you would save of carbon and that cost, worked out to about $2,887 a ton. That's according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. By 2032, that's how much that emissions cap policy is going to cost you.
And then compare that to what you just said. We were worried about $180 per ton, even going up to the $170, in about 5 years' time. Yeah. So once again,
So the impacts on the Canadian economy for the benefit you're getting in emissions reduction just do not match up. Now, I took it one step further, Mike, because that's obvious. That's already an eye-popping, we should not go forward with this policy, obviously number. There's a constitutional issues with it too. But then I looked at how many emissions globally are you displacing? Because that's just internal in Canada. So that's how much cost to get rid of that emissions produced in Canada. But if you get rid of it in Canada, do we expect global demand to go down because there's emissions cap in Canada? No, we don't. So almost certainly those barrels will be produced elsewhere. And so we aren't talking about just reducing our own production here. How much are we displacing globally? And the answer is, even with oil sands, our highest producing production, it's only about 1 to 3% higher than the average barrel. So now you're talking about a $100,000 to $300,000 ton of emissions, the price to remove a ton of emissions globally. If you're talking about LNG, where we are actually one of the lowest emitting producers in the world, now your cost per ton of emissions is infinite. In fact, the more Canadian LNG you take off the global market, the more global emissions rise.
Yeah.
And so it's these unintended, consequences. Just to point out, economists may say this is elegant solution. On the business side, you're saying this makes no sense.
Well, I worry that so much of the policy in the last several years, and seriously, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed ideologically based, not research based, not practical based. And that's why it was so easy to criticize There was just so much there. And you go, well, we could talk EV and the money that Canada's committed to electric vehicles. And again, what are those emission reductions? Because that's still the principal purpose of it. And you go, that doesn't make sense. I've traveled and I've had good fortune to live in other parts of the world. And I'm thinking of being in India, being in Malaysia, being in others, and Africa. My gosh, think of if we took the same amount of money and put it into specific programs there, you could have a much more dramatic emissions reduction. And that still, we're told, is the goal.
I know, yeah. And this is, then you start to question, is the goal to reduce emissions or is it to quash the oil and gas sector because you don't like big oil? And it sure looks confusing sometimes, when you put some of these policies that aren't really reducing emissions the best way. The EV mandate is a great example where all the EV subsidies, very expensive way to reduce emissions. Everyone heralds the Norwegian model. That worked out to about $800 a ton, per emissions displaced. But it's also a terribly regressive policy. And so that the people who are more likely to buy EVs are people who live in single family homes, who have a garage, who can install, a new electrical panel to support and can get a Tesla. Primarily, and this is just true facts, white, urban, male, upper class. That is the largest demographic of an EV buyer it is. And so the subsidies disproportionately serve those who need it the least. I guess if you just want to reduce emissions, you would make public transport cheaper.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that's not what they did. There have been policies that have been efficient in Canada. Reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas sector has probably been the cheapest, most successful way that we have reduced emissions. And in some cases, it's as cheap as, $10 a ton and maybe going up to $45 a ton. We've gotten rid of a ton of emissions that way. And it's that Alberta tier industrial carbon price that has incented it. But it's when it's when you start doing these top-down mandates, emissions cap, kind of these boutique announcements for the sake of announcements that, and we call it here, the pancake layer of regulation. And that pancake layer stifles investment. Money doesn't know where and when it can make money. It's too many regulations to deal with. There's too many unintended consequences, contradictory consequences. And so money flees and we're just left with a huge bill and about the same emissions.
And that comes back to my point about, there is this investment side. There's nothing happening here without people willing, and institutions and companies willing to invest their dollars.
Yep.
And to me, there still is a laundry list of things that beyond the announcements that Prime Minister Carney, which are more positive, I'll give him that, than Prime Minister Trudeau. But I still think the obstacle, you got the same cabinet ministers or the same caucus there. But you need some concrete changes. You need to change these, the moratorium for the tanker ban, as an example. You've got to give them something besides just the sort of happy talk politically, if we really are going to make any progress here. And in the meantime, the clock is ticking in terms of timetable. We keep pushing it out. I mean, one of the other things, sorry, I'm skipping around a bit here, but our time's short. You've written a lot on critical minerals. That's another one of those sort of buzzwords that all of a sudden the same people who couldn't have described one to me 3 years ago are now all over, including President Trump. Someone should explain to him what they are at some point here. But the other naivety is that we could want to do this our biggest desire. We're not getting anything out of the ground in 10 years. And, then you have back to Guilbeault saying, we're not going to build any new road infrastructure.
Yes.
Oh, that'll do it. Me as an investor, I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, I want to put my money where I can, even get it to market.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these were degrowth policies, and we're seeing, unfortunately, Europe is even a little further ahead and seeing the consequence of that and deindustrializing. And it's bigger players, car makers, factory owners, coming out, in Germany, especially hard and saying this is, economic insanity. But on critical minerals is another great example because it's maybe a little less contentious than oil and gas.
Yes.
But for example, where we did put so much money, about $50 billion into subsidies for EV plants, we want to be a battery powerhouse. It's the future, it's manufacturing, all those things. And the business case was we have all the minerals in Canada. So you might as well make it here because we have that secure supply chain. Well, since 2012, the production of cobalt, of nickel, of manganese, these things went down about 40%. Of copper went down about 9%. Lithium, almost no production. Rare earths, almost no production. So on the one hand, you're investing so much in the downstream, preposterous amounts really in the downstream. On the other hand, not even not investing in the upstream, but having these oppressive, regulations that just made Canadian mining uncompetitive with other parts, authoritarian, mostly parts of the world that we would rather have some security of supply. So just the inability to see the full picture, or inability to see the unintended consequences of some of these policies. As you say, it's been so easy to criticize because it was so blatantly wrong.
Yeah. Well, as I say, there's so much to talk about in these files that and I invite people to go to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. You're writing there, Heather's there, all sorts of articles there, and other places too. But I just think it's valuable. So let me just finish with this quick one. Or I'll finish with two. This is a really easy one. Close your eyes. Are we going to have a new pipeline to the West Coast 10 years out?
10 years out for sure.
Okay.
Again, Canada needs some boost to its GDP.
Yep.
If we're going to spend all this money on the military, which we kind of have to do, the world is it's not just to meet a number. The world is a more dangerous place, and we need to defend ourselves. Yeah. We're going to need to pay for it somehow, and there's an easy way to pay for it, and that's to increase our oil and gas production. And so I think at some point, if this government doesn't get it done, and they say they're going to get it done, then the people will choose a different government that will get it done.
Well, I know something that you had written is just describing, because we do have Trans Mountain, getting oil there, so we get it into a more competitive price environment where we have more than one, buyer. That it's making us an extra $8 a barrel, every day, about $35 million extra per day.
Yeah, so that's the differential between, we were selling to a discount. When people say we're selling to a discount, it's because we only had one buyer. And especially when pipeline egress was full, that discount between the West Texas Intermediate benchmark and Western Canada Select, so what our barrels are worth, it blew out to $50. Yeah, now, with Trans Mountain narrowed, it's, kind of between $5 to $10, narrower than it was before Trans Mountain. And as you say, every dollar, as I understand, that it is narrowed is, for example, just off the tops, $700 million for Alberta in royalties, and let alone the corporate taxes and the shareholder dividends. So Trans Mountain, $34 billion shouldn't have been, but it's worth every single penny.
Yeah. And just tells you the potential that we have if we move and decide to take advantage of all of those natural resources. I agreed with Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta when she said, man, did we ever have to work hard not to realize our potential? Because no one's got it better than we do. And I sat there nodding my head. Yeah.
Got to stop shooting ourselves in the foot. And this is, there's 200 countries in the world that wish they had Canada's problems. Yeah. Because all of our problems are ones that we put in front of us. Again, we were too lucky, we were too wealthy, we were too secure, and we got complacent. And now we're feeling the effects of that. We can't just keep gliding, off of kind of the dividend that we got post World War II. We have to start doing some things. But the great news is that we have, we still have all those tools. We still have tremendous resources in this country when more and more countries are going to see scarcity.
I can't help myself. I'm thinking if there's 200 countries that wouldn't mind trading, I've got several politicians I'm willing to put up for sale at a moment's notice. Heather, thank you so much for taking the time. And I want to put you on the spot here and say we got to visit again in the near future. There's so much more on that critical minerals file, especially with China's role when we talk about that level of security. There's so much more there. But in the meantime, they don't have to wait for that. They have to go and visit Heather's work at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And I'm glad that you were advising the Business Council of Canada, by the way.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Appreciate the time.